It was a hot summer day in the city. The streets were busy with people going about their day. Cars honked, and shops were open for business. On the corner of Main Street stood a small cafe where people sat outside, drinking cold drinks to beat the heat. Walking down the sidewalk was an old man named George. He was tall and thin with white hair. George wore a simple blue shirt and brown pants. Next to him walked his small dog, Buddy. Buddy was a light brown terrier mix with floppy ears and bright eyes. The dog walked happily beside George, his leash loose between them. They did this walk every day, rain or shine. George loved Buddy very much. The dog had been his only friend since his wife died 3 years ago. Everyone in the neighborhood knew them. Shop owners would wave as they passed by. Some even kept dog treats behind their counters for when Buddy visited. "Good morning, George." "Hi there, Buddy," called Mrs. Chen from her flower shop. She stepped out and gave Buddy a quick pat on the head. "Morning, Mrs. Chen. Beautiful day, isn't it?" George replied with a smile. As George and Buddy continued their walk, they passed by the local bank. The sound of loud motorcycles suddenly filled the air. A group of 5 bikers pulled up to the curb, their big machines making a terrible noise. People turned to look as the bikers parked in a row. The leader of the group was a man named Vince. He was big and strong with a thick beard and many tattoos on his arms. He wore a black leather vest with patches and ripped jeans. Vince had a mean look in his eyes as he got off his bike. The other bikers followed him, laughing loudly and pushing each other. "Man, I'm bored," said Vince, looking around the street. "This town is dead." One of the other bikers, a skinny man named Rat, nodded. "Yeah, boss. Nothing exciting ever happens here." Vince lit a cigarette and blew smoke into the air. "We need to liven things up a bit, don't we, boys?" The other bikers laughed and agreed. Just then, George and Buddy walked past the group of bikers. Buddy, being the friendly dog he was, wagged his tail at the new people. George tried to walk faster, pulling Buddy along. He didn't like the look of these men. Vince noticed the old man and his dog. A cruel smile spread across his face. "Hey boys, watch this," he said to his friends. "I'm gonna have some fun." As George and Buddy passed by, Vince stepped forward into their path. George stopped walking, surprised. Buddy stood there, still wagging his tail, not knowing any better. "Nice dog you got there, old man," Vince said, looking down at Buddy. "Thank you," George said quietly, trying to move around the big biker. But Vince didn't move out of the way. Instead, he looked at his friends and winked. "You think that mutt can do any tricks?" Before George could answer, Vince suddenly lifted his heavy boot and kicked at Buddy. The dog yelped in pain and fear, jumping back behind George's legs. The kick wasn't hard enough to seriously hurt the dog, but it was enough to scare him badly. "Hey," George shouted, his face turning red with anger. "What do you think you're doing?" Vince and his friends burst out laughing. "Just having a little joke, Grandpa," Vince said between laughs. "Can't you take a joke?" People on the street stopped to watch. Some looked worried, but nobody stepped forward to help the old man. George stood there, shaking with anger, holding Buddy close to him. The small dog was trembling, no longer wagging his tail. "You should leave us alone," George said, his voice shaking. "Or what?" Vince stepped closer to George, towering over him. "What are you gonna do about it, old man?" The situation was getting bad. George was afraid but trying to be brave for Buddy. The bikers surrounded him, still laughing. It seemed like no one was going to help. But then, a black car with tinted windows pulled up across the street. The black car stopped smoothly at the curb. It was shiny and expensive looking. The engine went quiet, and for a moment, nothing happened. Then, the driver's door opened. A man stepped out of the car. He was not very tall, but he looked strong. His head was shaved, and he wore a tight black t-shirt that showed his muscles. He had on dark jeans and black boots. His face was serious as he looked across the street. This man was Jason Statham, the famous movie star. He was in town to film his new action movie. Statham had been driving to the movie set when he saw what happened to the old man and his dog. He closed his car door and walked across the street. People on the sidewalk started to whisper. Some took out their phones to take pictures. It wasn't every day that a Hollywood star appeared on their street. "Is that who I think it is?" Someone whispered. "It's Jason Statham." Another person said louder. Vince and his biker friends were still laughing at George and Buddy. They didn't notice the man walking toward them. Buddy was still hiding behind George's legs, shaking with fear. "Why don't you and your stupid mutt go home before you get hurt?" Vince said to George, poking him in the chest with one finger. "I believe the gentleman asked you to leave him alone," said a deep voice with a British accent. Vince turned around, annoyed that someone was interrupting his fun. His eyes widened when he saw who was standing there. The other bikers also turned and fell silent. Statham stood with his feet apart, hands at his sides. His face was calm, but his eyes were hard and angry. "Mind your own business," Vince said, but his voice wasn't as confident as before. Statham took a step closer. "When I see a grown man bullying an elderly person and kicking a defenseless animal, it becomes my business." By now, a small crowd had gathered to watch. Some people had recognized the famous actor and were recording the scene on their phones. "Do you know who I am?" Vince asked, trying to sound tough. He puffed out his chest and stood taller. "No," Statham replied simply. "And I don't care. What I do care about is how you're treating this man and his dog." "Rat," the skinny biker tugged on Vince's sleeve. "Boss," he whispered urgently. "That's Jason Statham, the action movie guy." Vince's face changed. He looked less sure of himself now. He glanced at his friends, but they had all taken a step back. No one wanted to mess with Jason Statham. "It was just a joke," Vince said, shrugging. "We were just having some fun." "I don't see anyone laughing except you and your friends," Statham said. He walked over to George and Buddy. He bent down to check on the dog. "Is he all right?" Statham asked George gently. George nodded. "I think so. Thank you for stopping." Statham patted Buddy softly. The dog was still scared, but let Statham touch him. Then Statham stood up and faced Vince again. "Now I think you owe this gentleman and his dog an apology," Statham said. Vince looked around. His friends had moved even further away. The crowd was watching. Some people were still filming. Vince's face turned red with embarrassment. "I ain't apologizing for nothing," Vince said, crossing his arms. Statham sighed. He took another step toward Vince. His voice was quiet but firm when he spoke. "Let me explain something to you," Statham said. "I've spent the last 20 years playing tough guys in movies, but the difference between you and me is that I'm just acting. You, on the other hand, are really being a bully." Vince swallowed hard. He looked nervous now. "So," Statham continued, "you have two choices. You can apologize to this man and his dog, or we can continue this conversation in a way that you might not enjoy." The crowd held their breath. George held Buddy closer. The other bikers looked ready to run away. Vince stood there, trapped. He had to make a decision. Vince looked at Jason Statham, then at the crowd watching them. His face was red, and sweat ran down his forehead. He was not used to being in this position. Usually, people were afraid of him and his biker friends. But now he was the one feeling afraid. "Fine," Vince finally said in a low voice. He turned to George and Buddy. The dog was still hiding behind the old man's legs. "I'm sorry I kicked your dog." The apology didn't sound very real. Vince said the words quickly and didn't look George in the eyes. Statham crossed his arms and shook his head. "That's not good enough," Statham said. "Try again, and this time, mean it." Vince's hands made fists at his sides. For a moment, it looked like he might try to fight. But then he glanced at Statham's strong build and calm face. Vince was big, but he knew Statham was trained in real fighting for his movies. Vince took a deep breath. "I'm sorry, sir," he said to George in a clearer voice. "I shouldn't have kicked your dog. It was wrong of me." George nodded slowly. "Thank you for the apology," he said. "I hope you learned from this." Buddy peeked out from behind George's legs. The dog still looked nervous, but not as scared as before. "Now apologize to the dog," Statham said. Vince's mouth fell open. "You want me to say sorry to a dog?" That's exactly what I want," Statham cut in. "You hurt him. He deserves an apology too." Some people in the crowd laughed quietly. Vince's face turned even redder. His biker friends were looking away, pretending they didn't know him. Rat was even smiling a little. Feeling totally embarrassed, Vince bent down toward Buddy. "I'm sorry I kicked you, dog," he mumbled. Buddy stayed behind George, but his tail moved a tiny bit. "Good," Statham said. "Now, I think you and your friends should leave. This neighborhood doesn't need your kind of jokes." Vince stood up straight again. He looked like he wanted to say something angry, but he kept quiet. He nodded stiffly and turned to his motorcycle. "Come on, guys. Let's go," Vince said to his friends. The other bikers quickly got on their bikes. They were happy to leave this awkward situation. As they started their motorcycles, Vince looked back at Statham. "This isn't over," he said, trying to sound tough again. Statham just raised one eyebrow. "I think it is," he replied calmly. The bikers drove away, their motorcycles roaring loudly. People on the street cheered and clapped. Some came up to Statham, asking for pictures and autographs. But Statham turned to George and Buddy first. "Are you both okay?" he asked. George smiled with relief. "Yes, thanks to you. I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stopped." Buddy came out from behind George's legs. The dog seemed to understand that the danger was gone. He sniffed at Statham's hand, and then let the actor pet him. "He likes you," George said. "Buddy is usually good at knowing who the good people are." Statham smiled as he petted the dog. "Smart fellow," he said. "What's your name, sir?" "I'm George Wilson. I live just down the street. And this brave little guy is Buddy." A woman from the crowd came closer with her phone. "Mr. Statham, could I please get a picture with you? My kids won't believe I met you." Soon, more people gathered around. They all wanted to meet the famous actor who had stood up to the mean biker. Statham was kind to everyone, but he kept checking that George and Buddy were okay. What no one noticed was that far down the street, Vince and his biker friends had stopped their motorcycles. They were watching from a distance, and Vince did not look happy at all. After meeting all the fans and signing some autographs, Jason Statham walked with George and Buddy back to George's house. George lived in a small blue house with a neat garden in front. Flowers grew along the path to the door. "Would you like to come in for some tea?" George asked Statham. "It's the least I can do to thank you." Statham checked his watch. "I have some time before I need to be on set. Tea sounds perfect." They went inside the house. It was clean but simple. Photos of George with a woman filled the walls and shelves. Buddy went to his water bowl in the kitchen and started drinking. "Please, sit down," George said, pointing to a chair at the kitchen table. He put a kettle of water on the stove to boil. "The dog seems fine now. No harm done, thanks to you." "I'm glad I was driving by," Statham said. "I can't stand bullies." While the water heated up, George took out 2 cups and some tea bags. "That's my late wife, Martha," he said, nodding toward a large photo on the wall. "She died 3 years ago. Buddy was her dog, really. Now he's all I have left of her." Statham looked at the photo of the smiling woman. "I'm sorry for your loss," he said softly. "Thank you," George replied. "That's why I was so upset when that biker kicked Buddy. He's more than just a dog to me." The kettle whistled, and George poured hot water into the cups. He brought them to the table and sat down across from Statham. "So, you're making a movie here in town?" George asked, changing the subject. "Yes, an action film. We're shooting at the old factory building by the river." Statham explained. I play a former soldier who has to save a small town from bad guys. George smiled. Sounds like what you did for me and Buddy today. They both laughed. Buddy came and sat by Statham's feet, looking up at him with friendly eyes. Outside, down the street, Vince and his biker friends were still watching George's house. They had parked their motorcycles in an empty lot nearby. I can't believe you let that actor make you look weak, said one of the bikers named Spike. He was a large man with a long beard. You apologized to a dog. Vince's face was dark with anger. Shut up. What was I supposed to do? Fight a famous movie star with everyone watching? That would have been stupid. So what are we doing here? Asked Rat, looking nervous. We should just leave town. That Statham guy could cause us real trouble. No, Vince said firmly. Nobody embarrasses me like that and gets away with it. I just need to think of a way to get back at them. At the old man and his dog. Spike asked. Yes, and maybe at Statham too, if I get the chance, Vince answered. He was making a plan in his mind. Back inside George's house, Statham and George were finishing their tea. Buddy had fallen asleep under the table. I should get going, Statham said, standing up. The director will be wondering where I am. Of course, George said. Thank you again for your help today. It was no problem, Statham replied. But listen, George, those bikers might still be angry. Here's my phone number. He wrote it on a piece of paper. Call me if you have any trouble. George took the paper. I'm sure they've learned their lesson, but thank you. Statham bent down to pat Buddy one more time. The dog woke up and licked his hand. Take care of your human, Buddy, Statham said with a smile. George walked Statham to the door. As they stepped outside, neither of them noticed Vince and his friends watching from their hiding place down the street. Perfect, Vince whispered to his gang. Now we know where the old man lives. That night, George ate dinner alone with Buddy at his feet. He gave the dog an extra treat. You had a scary day today, didn't you, boy? George said. Buddy wagged his tail and ate the treat happily. After washing the dishes, George sat in his armchair to watch the news. Buddy jumped up and lay beside him. George stroked the dog's soft fur and thought about what had happened. He still couldn't believe that Jason Statham, the famous movie star, had helped him and then come to his house for tea. Martha would never believe this story, George said to Buddy with a smile. The dog looked up at him with big brown eyes. Outside George's house, across the street, Vince sat on his motorcycle watching. The street was dark now, with only a few streetlights. Most houses had their lights on as families got ready for bed. Vince wore all black clothes to blend into the shadows. His phone rang. It was Spike calling. Yeah, Vince answered. Are you still watching the old man's house? Spike asked. This is stupid, boss. Let's forget about it and move on. No way, Vince said in a low, angry voice. That old man and his mutt made me look bad in front of everyone. And that actor, he's going to pay too. What are you planning to do? Spike sounded worried. I'm not sure yet. Maybe take the dog, or mess up the old man's house, Vince said. I'll figure it out. I don't want any part of this, Spike said. It's too much. You're talking about breaking the law now. Fine. Be a coward, Vince spat. I'll do it myself. He hung up the phone angrily. Back at the movie set, Jason Statham was filming a fight scene. He punched and kicked the stunt actors, following the moves they had practiced. The director yelled cut, and everyone stopped. Great job, Jason, the director said. Let's take a short break and then do one more take. Statham grabbed a bottle of water and sat in a chair. He thought about George and Buddy. Something didn't feel right. Those bikers, especially their leader, had looked too angry when they left. Statham had seen that kind of anger before. It was the kind that didn't go away quickly. He took out his phone and looked at the time. It was late, almost 10 o'clock p.m. Would George be awake? Should he call to check on him? Statham decided to send a text message instead. "Hey George, it's Jason Statham. Just checking that you and Buddy are okay. Let me know if you need anything." He sent the message and took another drink of water. The director called him back for the next scene, so Statham put his phone away and went back to work. In George's house, the old man was getting sleepy. He turned off the TV and stood up slowly. His phone made a sound, showing he had a new message. George didn't use his phone much, so he was surprised. He put on his glasses and read the message from Statham. "That's very kind of him," George said to Buddy. He typed a reply. "We are fine. Thank you for checking. Good luck with your movie." George put his phone down and walked to the kitchen to let Buddy out into the backyard one last time before bed. He opened the back door, and Buddy ran out into the dark yard. "Don't be long, Buddy," George called. What George didn't know was that Vince had moved from the front of the house to the back. The biker was now hiding behind a tree in George's backyard. When he saw Buddy come outside alone, a cruel smile spread across Vince's face. "Perfect," Vince whispered. He took a piece of meat from his pocket. He had put something in the meat to make any dog that ate it fall asleep. "Here, doggy," he called softly, holding out the meat. Buddy heard Vince's voice and stopped running. The small dog turned toward the sound and sniffed the air. He could smell the meat. Buddy was always hungry, and the meat smelled good. He took a few steps toward Vince, who was still hiding behind the tree. "That's it. Come here," Vince whispered, holding out the meat. "Take a nice bite." But then Buddy stopped. He smelled something else on the meat, something that wasn't right. The dog started to growl, his body becoming stiff. Buddy might be small, but he was smart. He knew this man was the same one who had kicked him earlier that day. "Stupid dog," Vince muttered. He stepped out from behind the tree and moved toward Buddy. "Just eat the meat." Buddy barked loudly, backing away from Vince. The dog kept barking, trying to warn George that something was wrong. Inside the house, George heard Buddy barking. This wasn't his normal bark. It sounded scared and angry. "Buddy," George called, walking back to the door. "What's wrong, boy?" George opened the door wider and looked out into the yard. In the dim light, he could see Buddy backing away from a large shadow. It was a person. "Hey, who's there?" George shouted, stepping outside. His heart was beating fast. Vince turned and faced George. "Well, hello there, old man. Remember me?" George's eyes went wide. "You, the biker from today. What are you doing in my yard?" "I came to borrow your dog," Vince said with an ugly laugh. "Me and him have some unfinished business." Buddy ran to George and stood in front of him, still barking at Vince. The dog was trying to protect his owner. "Get off my property right now," George said in a strong voice. He was scared, but he wasn't going to show it, or I'll call the police. Vince moved closer. "Go ahead and try, old man. By the time they get here, I'll be gone. And so will your mutt." George reached into his pocket for his phone, but it wasn't there. He had left it inside on the table. George looked at his back door, wondering if he could get to it before Vince caught him. Looking for this, Vince held up a phone. It was his own, but in the dark, George couldn't tell. "I found it on your table when I checked your house earlier. You should lock your windows." George felt cold with fear. Had Vince been inside his house? Was he lying? At the movie set, Jason Statham had finished his last scene for the day. He checked his phone and saw George's reply. Something still didn't feel right to him. The message seemed fine, but Statham had learned to trust his instincts over the years, and right now his instincts were telling him that George and Buddy might be in trouble. "Hey Mike," Statham called to one of the stunt drivers. "Can I borrow your motorcycle? It's important." Mike tossed him the keys. "Sure thing. Just bring it back in one piece." Statham caught the keys and ran to the parking lot. He found Mike's black motorcycle, started it, and drove away from the set. He headed toward George's house, going as fast as he safely could. The streets were mostly empty at this late hour, which helped him move quickly. Back in George's yard, Vince was moving closer. "I'm going to take your dog now," he said, "and there's nothing you can do about it." "Leave us alone," George said, his voice shaking a little. "You've caused enough trouble." "Oh, I'm just getting started," Vince replied. Buddy kept barking, louder and louder. Lights were coming on in the neighbors' houses. People were wondering what was causing all the noise. "Shut that dog up," Vince snapped. He took another step toward George and Buddy. Suddenly, they all heard the sound of a motorcycle engine roaring down the street. It was getting closer and closer to George's house. The motorcycle sound grew louder and louder. Then it stopped right in front of George's house. Vince looked worried for a moment. He took a step back from George and Buddy. "Expecting company, old man?" Vince asked, his voice less confident now. Before George could answer, they heard the gate to the backyard opening. Heavy footsteps came down the path. A beam of light from a phone flashlight cut through the darkness. "George, Buddy, are you out here?" called a familiar voice with a British accent. "Jason, we're over here," George called out, feeling a huge wave of relief. Jason Statham walked into the backyard, his phone light shining on the scene. He saw George, Buddy, and Vince standing there. Statham's face turned serious when he recognized the biker. "You again," Statham said to Vince. "I thought we had sorted this out earlier today." Vince tried to look tough. "This has nothing to do with you, movie star. This is between me and the old man." Statham moved to stand beside George and Buddy. The dog stopped barking and wagged his tail at the sight of Statham. "How did you know to come?" George asked Statham quietly. "Just a feeling," Statham replied. "Glad I trusted it." He turned back to Vince. "What are you doing here?" Vince held up the piece of meat he had been trying to feed Buddy. "Just bringing the dog a treat. To say sorry, you know. At 11 o'clock at night. In someone's backyard without permission." Statham didn't believe him for a second. "What's really in that meat?" Vince's face gave him away. He looked guilty and angry at the same time. "I think you should leave," Statham said firmly. "Now, before I call the police." "You can't make me go nowhere," Vince said, but he was backing up slowly toward the fence. "You're not a real cop. You just play one in movies." "You're right," Statham agreed calmly. "I'm not a cop, but I did learn some very real fighting skills for my films." He took a step toward Vince. "Would you like me to show you?" Vince looked at Statham's strong build. Even in the dim light, Vince could see that Statham was not someone to mess with. The biker was big, but Statham looked like he really knew how to fight. "This isn't over," Vince said, trying to sound brave as he backed away more quickly. "Yes, it is," Statham replied. "It was over this morning when you apologized. You just didn't accept it." He took out his phone. "I'm calling the police now." That was enough for Vince. He turned and ran through the yard, jumping over the fence at the back. They heard him crashing through the bushes behind George's property, running away. George let out a long breath and put his hand on Statham's shoulder. "Thank you. I don't know what he would have done if you hadn't come." Statham put his phone away. "Are you both okay?" "We're fine," George said. Buddy barked once as if to agree. "But how did you know we needed help?" "I sent you a message saying we were okay." "Something just didn't feel right," Statham explained. "I learned to trust my instincts." He looked at the meat Vince had dropped on the ground. "I bet he put something in that to hurt Buddy or make him sleep." George picked up Buddy and held him close. "What a terrible man." "Let's go inside," Statham suggested. "I'll help you check all the doors and windows. Make sure that lowlife was lying about getting into your house." They walked back into George's kitchen. Statham closed and locked the door behind them. Buddy jumped from George's arms and began sniffing around the house, checking for any strange smells. "I'll put some coffee on," George said. "I don't think I'll be sleeping much tonight anyway." As George filled the coffee pot with water, Statham walked through the house, checking all the windows and doors. Everything seemed secure. Vince had been lying about getting inside earlier, but Statham was still worried. Men like Vince didn't give up easily when they felt humiliated. George and Jason Statham sat at the kitchen table, drinking coffee. Buddy lay at their feet, finally calm after the scary event in the backyard. It was now past midnight, but neither man felt like sleeping. "I think you should report this to the police," Statham said. "That man tried to hurt your dog and threatened you in your own home." George nodded slowly. "You're right. I'll go to the police station tomorrow morning." He looked down at Buddy. "I never thought that standing up to a bully would lead to all this trouble." "Bullies don't like being stood up to," Statham said. "It hurts their pride. And men like that biker care a lot about their pride." They heard a knock at the front door. Both men looked at each other in surprise. Who would be visiting at this late hour? "Stay here," Statham said, standing up. He walked carefully to the front door and looked through the peephole. "It's the police," he told George. Statham opened the door. Two police officers stood there, a man and a woman. They looked serious. "Good evening, sir," the male officer said. Then his eyes widened in surprise. "Are you Jason Statham?" "Yes, I am," Statham replied. "How can I help you, officers?" The female officer spoke next. "We got calls from several neighbors about shouting and a dog barking. They were worried something was wrong at this address." George came to the door with Buddy in his arms. "That was my dog, officers. We had a problem with a man in my backyard." The officers came inside, and everyone sat in the living room. George explained everything that had happened, from the morning incident when Vince kicked Buddy to the backyard confrontation just an hour ago. Statham added details about how he had felt worried and come to check on George. "This is serious," the female officer said, writing everything in her notebook. "Breaking into someone's yard, threatening you, and trying to harm your pet. Do you know this man's full name?" "Only his first name, Vince," George said, "but I could describe him very well." "I know he rides with a biker group," Statham added. "There were 4 or 5 of them this morning. One was called Rat, I think." The male officer nodded. "That sounds like Vince Murdoch and his gang. We've had problems with them before." "We'll put out an alert for him," the female officer said. "And we'll have patrol cars drive by your house regularly for the next few days, Mr. Wilson." George thanked the officers. Before they left, the male officer asked Statham for an autograph for his son, looking a bit embarrassed to ask. Statham signed it with a smile. After the police left, George looked tired. The excitement and fear had worn him out. "Why don't you try to get some sleep?" Statham suggested. "I can stay on your couch tonight, if that would make you feel safer." "You would do that?" George asked, surprised. "Don't you have to film your movie tomorrow?" "Not until the afternoon," Statham replied. "I'll call the director in the morning and explain. He'll understand." George felt a wave of gratitude. "Thank you. I would feel better knowing you're here. I have spare blankets and pillows for the couch." While George got the bedding, Statham checked all the doors and windows one more time. Then he called the movie set security team. He explained the situation and asked if they could send someone to watch George's house after he left for filming tomorrow. The security team agreed to help. Meanwhile, across town in a rundown bar, Vince sat drinking a beer. His face was red with anger and embarrassment. The other bikers had abandoned him. Even Rat had said this revenge plan was going too far. "Nobody makes a fool of me," Vince muttered to himself. "Nobody." He took out his phone and looked at something on the screen. It was the address of the movie set where Statham was filming. Vince had looked it up online. A cruel smile spread across his face. He now had a new plan, and this time he would make sure both Statham and the old man with his stupid dog would pay. The next morning, George woke up feeling better after a good night's sleep. He found Jason Statham in the kitchen, making breakfast. Buddy sat by Statham's feet, looking up hopefully for a piece of bacon. "You didn't have to cook," George said, surprise. "I don't mind," Statham replied with a smile. "I called the set. They don't need me until 2 o'clock, so I can go with you to the police station this morning." After breakfast, they drove to the police station in Statham's car. Many people stared as they walked in. It wasn't every day that a famous movie star visited the local police station. The officers took George's full statement about Vince and his threats. They promised to find Vince and arrest him. "A security guard will be at your house when I'm filming," Statham told George as they left the station. "And here's something else for you." He handed George a small device. "It's a panic button. Press it if you're in danger, and it will call for help." "Thank you for everything," George said, deeply moved by Statham's kindness. Later that afternoon, Statham arrived at the movie set. It was at an old factory building by the river. Trucks, cameras, and lots of people filled the area. Statham went to his trailer to get ready for his scenes. What Statham didn't know was that Vince was watching the set from across the street. The biker had been there for hours, waiting. He wore a baseball cap pulled low to hide his face. "Time for some real action, movie star," Vince muttered to himself. He had a simple but dangerous plan. He would set a small fire near the equipment trucks to cause confusion. Then, in the chaos, he would find a way to hurt Statham or damage his car. As afternoon turned to evening, the film crew set up for a night scene. Bright lights lit up the factory. Statham came out of his trailer wearing a costume for his role as a tough soldier. Vince saw his chance. Most people were focused on the scene they were about to film. He moved closer to the set, keeping in the shadows. He took out a lighter and some rags he had soaked in gasoline. But before Vince could put his plan into action, he felt a wet nose touch his hand. Startled, he looked down. A small brown dog was sniffing his hand where he had held the meat the night before. "Buddy," Vince whispered in shock. "What are you doing here?" "He's with me," said a voice behind Vince. The biker spun around to find George standing there. "You? How did you find me?" Vince demanded. "We didn't find you," said another voice. Vince turned again and saw a security guard from the movie set. "You've been watched since you arrived. Mr. Statham warned us about you." Before Vince could run, 2 police officers appeared and grabbed him. The female officer was the same one who had come to George's house the night before. "Vince Murdoch, you're under arrest," she said, putting handcuffs on him. "For trespassing, making threats, attempted animal cruelty, and now attempted arson." The police found the gasoline-soaked rags and lighter in Vince's pockets. It was all the evidence they needed. As they led Vince away, he saw Statham walking toward them, having been alerted by the security team. "You set me up," Vince yelled at Statham. "No," Statham replied calmly. "You did this to yourself when you decided to be a bully." After Vince was taken away, Statham turned to George. "What are you doing here?" "How's Buddy?" George smiled. "The security guard you sent to my house told me about your concerns that Vince might come here. I wanted to help, so we came along. And Buddy has a good nose. He smelled that man right away." Statham bent down to pet Buddy, who wagged his tail happily. "Good dog," he said. "You're the real hero today." The film director walked over, curious about all the excitement. When Statham explained everything that had happened, from the first incident with the dog to Vince's arrest, the director was amazed. "That's a better story than the one we're filming," the director exclaimed. He looked at George and Buddy thoughtfully. "You know, we have a scene tomorrow with a grandfather and a dog. Our dog actor got sick. Would you two be interested in being in the movie?" George's eyes widened in surprise. "Us? In a movie?" Statham put his hand on George's shoulder. "What do you say? Want to be film stars for a day?" George looked down at Buddy, who barked once as if saying yes. "I think we'd love that," George said with a big smile. Martha would never believe it. And that's how an ordinary walk with a dog led to an extraordinary friendship between an old man and a movie star, all because someone stood up against a bully.